something living in the attic. The Harris family moved to a small town to start life with a clean slate. David, Emma, and their 2 children, Kate and Tom, searched for a long time for a house that could accommodate their growing family, and finally found an old but cozy building on the outskirts of the city. The house was spacious, with classic wooden floors, vintage furniture, and an attic, which was reached by a narrow staircase. The previous owners had sold it at a very good price, which immediately alerted David, but the house looked perfect. Emma was delighted with the antique charm, and the children had already begun to sort out their rooms. In the early days, everything went smoothly. David and Emma were busy unpacking, and the children were enthusiastically exploring the house. Tom, the youngest of the children, was especially interested in the attic, the ancient beams and gloomy atmosphere of which excited his imagination. However, Emma immediately forbade him to go up there without adults, warning about dust and the possibility of encountering spiders. Tom obeyed, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes. A few days after the move, the first oddities began to occur. At first, these were minor sounds that could be attributed to old pipes or the sagging of wooden floors. Kate, the older sister, claimed that she hears a quiet rustle in the attic at night, but her parents waved her off, explaining everything by simply aging at home. However, the sounds became clearer every day. They resembled footsteps, barely audible, as if someone was moving slowly through the attic, walking heavily. The following week, Emma discovered that some things were disappearing from the house. At first, it was small items, pens, old books, Tom's toys. But then she noticed the loss of larger items, such as a bedspread from the bedroom and several pillows. At first, she thought that the children had taken them for themselves, or that they had accidentally gotten stuck in boxes with things that they had not yet sorted out. But after checking everything, Emma realized that things had disappeared without a trace. When she shared her concerns with David that evening, he just smiled. "The house is old. It could have been lost," he reassured her. "You probably just forgot where you put them." But Emma was confident in herself. Things were disappearing, and the sounds from the attic were getting louder. She began to climb the stairs to the attic, but each time she was seized with an inexplicable fear that would not allow her to enter inside. A week after the disappearance of the first things, an incident occurred that made the family wary. Kate woke up in the middle of the night and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed the door leading to the attic, she suddenly felt a cold breeze, as if someone had opened the door. Kate froze, and her gaze went up the stairs. In the dark, she noticed something strange. The attic door, which her parents usually locked, was ajar. Kate felt rooted to the spot, and a strange feeling of horror shot through her. For a moment, she thought she saw something glittering in the darkness through the crack of the door, like 2 cold eyes watching her. The girl shuddered and rushed back to her room, wrapping her head in a blanket. She was afraid to even move and soon fell asleep, convincing herself that it was just a dream. The next day, Kate told her mother about everything, but Emma just shrugged her shoulders, trying not to show her concern. She began to notice the oddities herself, but did not want to scare the children. A few days passed, and more little things began to bother Emma and David. At night, the sounds in the attic grew louder, as if someone was moving, rearranging furniture or scratching on the floor. One day, late at night, when David was working in his office, he heard a strange sound, like a muffled groan. He froze, listening, but the sound disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. He decided to ignore it, but deep down he began to realize that the house held something more than he was willing to admit. That night, the family was woken up again by a loud bang upstairs. All four of them ran out of their rooms and met in the hallway. Emma hugged Tom, who looked scared. "Maybe it's just rats or the wind," David suggested, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Tomorrow we'll go up to the attic and check everything out." But the next morning, when they tried to open the attic door, it was locked from the inside. David tried to push harder, but the door wouldn't budge, as if something was holding her back, preventing her from entering. Kate and Tom looked scared, and Emma felt excitement mixed with inexplicable fear.
In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly oppressive. The family couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was watching them. Kate and Tom began to notice strange shadows flickering around the corner when they were alone in their rooms. One day, Tom told me that at night he hears someone calling his name softly. It was like a whisper, barely audible but frighteningly insistent. Emma tried to calm her son down, explaining that it was just his imagination, but her own anxiety was growing. One night, Kate woke up again to a strange noise. She could hear something moving slowly down the hallway. The girl's breathing became ragged as she heard footsteps approaching her door and then fading away. Kate held her breath, listening to the silence, but then the sound was gone. The next morning, she found a small piece of cloth by her closet door, as if someone had left it on purpose. The fabric was dirty and smelled damp, as if it had been lying in the attic for a long time. Emma and David began to get seriously worried. They contacted the previous owners of the house, but they refused to talk about the attic, only muttering something about how sometimes it's better not to know everything. This conversation only increased their fears, leaving more questions than answers. A few days later, having gathered his strength, David decided to open the attic door. With a hammer and a crowbar in his hands, he went to the door, while Emma and the children watched from around the corner. Finally, the door gave way, and David cautiously stepped inside. The smell of dust and dampness filled the air, and the dim light from the small window illuminated only part of the attic. But in the farthest corner, he saw something unusual. It was a strange wooden chest covered with an old cloth. He looked like he hadn't been touched in years, but there were things scattered around him that were missing from the house: pillows, a bedspread, even Tom's toy. David felt a chill run down his spine. He carefully opened the chest and found another old diary inside, which was written by the previous owners of the house. The pages of the diary described a mysterious creature living in the attic, which should not be disturbed. The more David read, the more he realized that this creature might not just be fiction. Suddenly, he heard a soft, almost whispering sound behind him, and turning around, saw that the attic door had slammed shut of its own accord, cutting him off from his family. David, left alone in the attic, felt the fear take hold of him with renewed vigor. The darkness seemed to thicken around them, and the air became suffocatingly cold. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Outside the door, Emma and the children were calling for him, but their voices sounded muffled, as if they were on the other side of the house. He realized that he was trapped. David tried not to panic and concentrate on finding a way out. His gaze returned to the old chest where he had found the diary. He picked it up again, hoping to find at least some clue. The pages of the diary were covered with careless, trembling lines, as if the author had written in fear. It spoke of an ancient evil that, as it was written, never sleeps and always waits for those who disturb its peace. The more David read, the more terrified he became. The diary described strange things. The owners of the house, their servants, and even rare guests said that they heard voices and saw strange shadows gliding through the house. This creature seemed to be playing with them, waiting for the moment when fear would take over them completely. Emma and the children on the other side of the attic door began to panic. Emma tried to kick down the door, but it was closed as if it was locked with an invisible lock. Kate and Tom looked at their mother anxiously, not understanding what was going on. Emma finally decided to call the police, but the connection was unexpectedly cut off. The phone was not picking up, as if the house itself did not allow her to call for help. They spent the whole night huddled under the attic door. Emma held Tom's hand, trying to hide her fear, and Kate, trembling, clung to her shoulder. They hoped to the last to hear from David at least some kind of answer, but there was no sound from outside the door, as if he was in a completely different place. Emma was tired of knocking on the door and calling her husband. By morning, they felt their strength begin to leave them, and clinging to each other, fell asleep right on the floor. When they woke up to the faint morning light barely filtering through the windows, Emma immediately tried to open the door again, desperately hoping that now the door would give way. In the attic, in the dark, David continued to struggle with panic. Every minute he felt more and more the presence of something otherworldly, invisible, but eerily real. As soon as his hands began to tremble, a barely audible sound resembling a whisper came from the depths of the room. "You shouldn't have come here," flashed somewhere behind him. The voice sounded quiet, like a snake hissing in the night. David turned around, but saw nothing but emptiness and half-rotted wooden beams. Gathering his courage, he went back to the chest and pulled out the remaining things. Among them was an old photograph showing people who looked like the previous owners of the house standing at the entrance. But behind them in the photo, David noticed something strange, a vague silhouette, like a shadow standing in the attic window. This shadow seemed alive and was watching them, as it was watching him at this moment. The door suddenly gave way, as if it had not been locked. David slowly came out of the attic, but he looked strange. His face was pale and his eyes were empty, as if he was looking through them. He didn't say a word when Emma rushed to him, hugging him and asking what happened. "David," she whispered, looking into his eyes, but he didn't seem to hear her. His face was expressionless, showing neither fear nor joy at being with his family again. He just stood there, staring into the void. His movements were slow and unnatural, as if his body was too heavy or immobile. Kate and Tom looked at their father with bated breath, feeling that something had changed in him. It was their dad, but at the same time it was no longer him. His eyes, once warm and alive, were now full of cold and emptiness. It seemed that the attic had forever taken away the part of him that made him human. Emma began to feel fear of her own husband. She felt that he no longer belonged to their world, that he had encountered something in the attic that had completely changed him, leaving only a shell. Emma, feeling that David was no longer who he used to be, took a step back, hugging the children to her. She knew that there was something dark and alien hidden in his empty gaze. Suddenly, David turned his head towards her, and his face lit up with a creepy, unnatural smile that made Emma go cold. "You didn't come alone, did you?" she whispered, not believing her own words. He nodded silently, and something dark flashed across his face, like a shadow that did not belong to him. The look in his eyes changed. It wasn't David, but someone using his body, his voice. He stepped forward, and every step he took seemed like a hollow echo of an alien presence. Then she realized that the one who lived in the attic was now free. The creature, which had been locked up for centuries, found its way out, using David as a guide. And now, nothing will be the same. Emma, gathering all her strength, turned around and dragged the children after her. Leaving everything behind, they ran out of the house, hearing the door slam behind them, as if putting an end to a story that they could not change. The house was left standing behind, gloomy and silent, and inside it, the sinister creature finally found its freedom. Emma knew that this was their last day in this house, and most importantly, the last time she saw David. Their lives will never be the same again. They will never be able to forget the one who stayed there forever, sharing their fears and nightmares.